The marker screeched against the board as Professor Linda Martinez completed the final equation. She stepped back, satisfied. The numbers stretched across the vast green surface, a mathematical riddle so complex that even her brightest students wouldn't dare attempt it. The lecture hall was packed, but the air was thick with hesitation. Linda turned, scanning the sea of faces. Nobody moved. Not a single hand was raised. As expected. Good. This was the moment she had built toward. The moment she would prove, in front of hundreds, that the concept of raw genius was a myth. That success wasn't a matter of innate brilliance, but of access, privilege, and systemic advantage. She let the silence hang, enjoying the weight of it. Then, unexpectedly, there was movement. Soft steps against the polished floor, the shuffle of worn shoes. A figure emerged from the shadows at the back of the hall, stepping forward with an easy, almost casual confidence. Heads turned, students whispered, a few exchanged glances, stifling chuckles. It wasn't one of them. It was the janitor, a middle-aged woman in a faded blue uniform, short-cropped, silver-threaded curls, calloused hands worn from years of work. In her right hand, she still clutched a damp rag, as if she'd simply wandered in from cleaning the stairwell. Linda's eyes narrowed. The woman, Evelyn Johnson, paused at the edge of the stage, glancing at the problem on the board as if studying an old memory. Then she looked at Linda, her expression unreadable. She reached for the marker. The murmurs in the hall rose in volume. A student in the front row scoffed. Someone whispered a joke, which was met with a few stifled laughs. Linda folded her arms. This was ridiculous. This equation was designed to be impenetrable, a challenge beyond even her most promising students. If this woman thought she could waltz in from the hallways with a mop and solve it, Linda stepped aside, wordlessly granting permission. Fine, let her try. Evelyn nodded, setting down her rag. She took the marker between her fingers, not like someone who was unfamiliar with it, not like a student nervously attempting a problem for the first time, but like someone reacquainting herself with an old tool. Then she began to write. The first numbers appeared, precise and fluid. A hush fell over the room. Students leaned forward. The chuckles stopped. The shifting of notebooks and restless movements stilled as everyone's eyes fixed on the board. The first equation was correct. The second line followed, equally precise. Linda's brow furrowed slightly. The calculations were fast. Too fast. Not the hesitant, trial and error scribbles of someone fumbling their way through the problem. Number. These were the movements of someone who had done this before. Someone who understood the deep logic beneath the numbers. The room was silent except for the rhythmic, deliberate strokes of the marker. Some students instinctively glanced toward their notebooks, comparing her work to their own failed attempts. She wasn't making mistakes. She wasn't hesitating. She wasn't even stopping to think. The tension in the room thickened, shifting from amusement to disbelief. Linda took a slow step forward, eyes locked on the board. Evelyn continued writing, each movement smooth and assured, as if she had rehearsed this exact problem 1,000 times. And then, too soon, impossibly soon, she placed the marker down. A moment of stillness. Linda's pulse quickened. She scanned the board. Line by line, her mind ran through the calculations, looking for errors, looking for gaps. None. Every number was correct. Every formula was properly applied. Every step was flawless. She felt something she hadn't expected, something rare, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Not just disbelief, not just curiosity, but something deeper, something dangerously close to admiration. Then, just as Linda was about to say something, a voice from the audience shattered the silence. A student, staring wide-eyed at the board, murmured under his breath, "She got it right." And just like that, the entire class erupted. The noise in the lecture hall swelled instantly, a tide of disbelief crashing against the impossible. Students turned to each other, whispering, murmuring, questioning what they had just witnessed. A few instinctively checked their phones, already searching for any clue about the janitor who had just shattered their expectations. Linda's jaw tightened. She should have stopped this earlier, should have dismissed it before it had a chance to spiral into whatever this was. But now it was too late. Evelyn Johnson had just done what no student in the room had even dared to attempt. And worse, she had done it effortlessly. Linda took a controlled breath, suppressing the unease rising in her chest. She refused to let it show. With slow, deliberate steps, she approached the board, her heels clicking against the floor. The sound was sharp, cutting through the escalating murmurs like a knife. Some students quieted, turning their attention back to her, waiting, perhaps hoping, that she would expose a flaw in the solution. She examined the equations closely, scanning for mistakes, inconsistencies, anything that would allow her to reclaim control of the room. Nothing. Every line, every transformation, every calculation was indisputably correct. She felt an unfamiliar weight settle in her stomach. Behind her, students continued their low conversations. The atmosphere had shifted from casual curiosity to something more intense. Some were intrigued, others visibly unsettled, because if the janitor had solved the problem, what did that say about them? Linda knew she needed to act. If she didn't, this moment would slip from her grasp, turning her meticulously planned lecture into something unrecognizable. She turned, letting her gaze settle on Evelyn. The woman stood there, calm, composed, completely unbothered by the reaction she had just provoked. There was no arrogance in her posture, no gloating in her expression. If anything, she seemed indifferent to the weight of the moment. Linda finally spoke, keeping her voice measured. "This solution," she began, choosing her words carefully, "is correct." A ripple of reaction spread through the room. A few students gasped softly. Others nodded, confirming what they had already suspected. "But," Linda continued, shifting her stance slightly, "the real question is, how?" She let the silence stretch, scanning the crowd. "How did she do this when none of you could?" The weight of the question settled over the room. Students exchanged glances, some looking embarrassed, others frustrated. A few in the front row lowered their gazes, as if the problem had suddenly become personal. Linda turned back to Evelyn, arms still crossed. Evelyn didn't react immediately. She simply met Linda's gaze, unblinking, unreadable. Then after a pause, she moved toward the table at the front of the room, where a stack of unused notebooks sat. Without hesitation, she picked one up, flipped it open, and, with the same quiet confidence, began writing. Linda frowned, stepping closer. The room, which had started to settle into whispers, went completely still again. Evelyn wasn't solving another problem. She was writing numbers, sequences, formulas, fast, too fast. Linda's breath caught slightly as she recognized what was happening. These weren't random calculations. They were derivations, core mathematical structures that formed the foundation of advanced problem-solving techniques. It was as if Evelyn wasn't just solving problems. She was recalling them from somewhere deeper, somewhere most people couldn't reach. Her hand moved without hesitation, filling the page with intricate equations, connections that even advanced students took years to master. She wasn't just good, she was extraordinary. The realization settled like a stone in Linda's chest. Evelyn finished writing and set the notebook down, completely unfazed by the stunned expressions around her. Linda picked up the notebook, flipping through the pages. Every number, every equation, flawless. This wasn't someone who had casually picked up math as a hobby. This was someone who had once lived inside these numbers. Someone who had walked the very halls of knowledge that Linda and her colleagues occupied, only to end up forgotten. And then, almost as if the thought had been waiting in the back of her mind, Linda made the connection. Evelyn Johnson. The name tugged at something distant, something buried beneath years of academia and routine. She had heard it before. But where? Linda's grip on the notebook tightened. Her thoughts raced. She had spent her career dismantling the myths of individual genius, arguing that success was a product of access, not raw talent. And yet standing before her was a woman who seemed to defy every argument she had ever made. A woman who should have been here among them, not outside the system looking in. A woman whose name, she was certain now, meant something more than just an unexpected anomaly. She needed answers. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't the one in control of the conversation. The lecture hall hadn't returned to normal. Even as students tried to refocus on their notes or pack up their things, an unspoken tension lingered in the air. Conversations buzzed in low whispers. Some scrolled through their phones, searching for any mention of Evelyn Johnson, trying to piece together how a university janitor had just outperformed an entire class of top-tier students. Linda remained at the front, notebook in hand, staring at the equations Evelyn had written. Each line was crisp, deliberate, evidence of a mind that had never lost its grip on mathematics, no matter how many years had passed. This wasn't just talent. This was mastery. The weight of it pressed against Linda's chest. She had built her reputation on the belief that raw genius was a fantasy, that success was about opportunity, not innate ability. But now, standing here with irrefutable proof in her hands, she felt something she hadn't expected. Doubt. She exhaled slowly and looked up. Evelyn was already heading toward the exit, moving through the dispersing crowd with quiet ease. She wasn't seeking recognition. She wasn't even looking back. Linda's fingers tightened around the notebook. This wasn't over. She stepped forward, weaving through the students, her gaze locked on Evelyn's fading silhouette. The murmurs followed her, half-formed theories, skeptical remarks, lingering disbelief. Linda barely registered them. By the time she reached the hallway, Evelyn was halfway down the corridor, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years blending into the background. Linda quickened her pace. Evelyn! The name left her lips before she could stop it. Evelyn didn't turn immediately. She paused as if considering whether to respond at all, then slowly glanced over her shoulder. For the first time, Linda saw her up close, without the context of the classroom or the board between them. There was no arrogance in her expression, no amusement, no expectation, just quiet patience. Linda held up the notebook. These formulas, she said, keeping her voice even, professional, controlled. They're not just correct, they're advanced. Evelyn's gaze flickered to the pages, then back to Linda's face. A long silence stretched between them. Then finally Evelyn exhaled and spoke. I remember them. 3 simple words, and yet they carried an entire history within them. Linda's pulse quickened. You were trained in this. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Evelyn studied her for a moment before responding. A long time ago. The hallway felt too small, too quiet. Students passed by in waves, oblivious to the weight of the conversation unfolding between them. Linda hesitated. She had spent years in academia, surrounded by brilliant minds, debating theories and dismantling outdated assumptions. But now, standing before a woman whose intellect rivaled some of the greatest scholars she had known, she realized something unsettling. She didn't know what to say next. Evelyn seemed to sense it. Her lips curved into something resembling a smile. Small, almost imperceptible. Then she turned, continuing down the hallway, her steps unhurried, deliberate. Linda watched her go, gripping the notebook like an anchor. This wasn't just an anomaly. This wasn't a coincidence. This was something bigger. And for the first time in a long, long time, Linda felt the pull of genuine curiosity. She had to know more. Linda couldn't let it go. The moment Evelyn disappeared down the hallway, the questions in her mind multiplied, refusing to settle. She had seen brilliant mathematicians in her career, but none had ever possessed the sheer, effortless command that Evelyn displayed. It wasn't just intelligence. It was precision honed over years of experience. That night, Linda sat at her desk, the notebook open in front of her. The equations Evelyn had written stared back at her, sharp and deliberate. This wasn't the work of someone who dabbled in mathematics. This was someone who had lived and breathed it. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard. She hesitated, then typed. Evelyn Johnson, mathematics, competition. The search results were immediate. At first, they were unimpressive, lists of people with the same name, unremarkable links. But then, buried between unrelated articles, something caught her eye. State Mathematics Olympiad Champion, 1989. Linda clicked. An old newspaper archive opened. The scanned image was grainy, the text faded, but the headline was clear. 17-year-old prodigy wins statewide math competition, and beneath it, a photo. Linda leaned in, her heart rate picking up. It was her. A much younger Evelyn, eyes burning with an intensity Linda now recognized, standing next to a whiteboard filled with equations. She wasn't just a competitor, she had won. Linda scrolled down. The article detailed Evelyn's rapid rise in the world of mathematics. She had been a prodigy, her talent undeniable. Professors had praised her. Institutions had taken notice. She was on track for something extraordinary. And then, nothing. No follow-up, no mention of where she had studied, no records of further achievements. It was as if, after that moment, she had vanished from the academic world entirely. Linda sat back, frowning. This didn't make sense. How did someone with that level of brilliance go from being a prodigy to working as a janitor? She checked the time, almost midnight, but she wasn't done. She clicked through old databases, searching for more. Scholarships, research papers, anything that could explain what had happened to Evelyn. But every search ended the same way, a promising future that had suddenly stopped. Linda rubbed her temples. Something had happened, and whatever it had changed the course of Evelyn's life completely. The next morning, Linda arrived at the university earlier than usual. The air was crisp, the halls quieter than they would be in an hour. She knew where she needed to go. She made her way toward the custodial office, a small room tucked away in the basement of the main building. It was a part of the university few ever bothered to notice. She found Evelyn there, rolling a cart stocked with cleaning supplies. For a moment, Linda just watched. There was something surreal about it. This woman who had once stood in the spotlight of academia, now moving through the world unnoticed, pushing a cart filled with rags and disinfectant. Evelyn sensed her presence and glanced up. Their eyes met. Linda held up the notebook. "I looked you up," she said. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but something in her posture stiffened. Linda continued, voice steady. "You won the State Mathematics Olympiad in '89. You were a prodigy." Evelyn didn't deny it. She simply exhaled, set down the spray bottle she was holding, and wiped her hands on a towel. Then she looked at Linda, her gaze calm, unreadable. "I used to be." The words were quiet, but they carried a weight Linda couldn't ignore. She wanted to ask why. Why had it ended? Why was Evelyn here, instead of where she was meant to be? But Evelyn didn't offer more. And Linda realized something. If she wanted answers, she wouldn't get them by asking. She would have to earn them. And for that, she had an idea. Linda stood in her office, staring at the whiteboard covered in equations. The numbers blurred slightly in her vision, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of realization. She had spent years dismantling the myth of innate genius, arguing that success was a product of privilege and access. Yet Evelyn had just torn through that belief without uttering a single argument. She had done it with pure mathematics, something even Linda couldn't ignore. She needed to understand. Over the years, Linda had met countless intelligent people, but she had never encountered someone like Evelyn. Her knowledge wasn't just intact, it was alive, moving, effortless. But what haunted Linda the most was the question she still couldn't answer. How had someone like Evelyn disappeared from academia? She checked her watch. The morning rush of students had started, the noise of hurried footsteps and half-awake conversations filling the hallways outside. Linda had spent the entire night thinking, piecing together fragments of Evelyn's past from online archives and old newspaper clippings. What she had found only deepened the mystery. Evelyn Johnson wasn't just a bright student. She had been a rising star, the kind of mind that institutions fought over, the kind of talent that was meant to shape the future, and then nothing. Linda's fingers tapped against the edge of her desk as she stared at the screen. No research papers, no academic records, no further competitions. It was as if Evelyn had been erased. She knew she needed to talk to her again. But this time, it wouldn't be out of curiosity. It would be an invitation. By noon, she found Evelyn in the same quiet hallway where they had last spoken. This time, Evelyn saw her coming. There was no surprise in her expression, no sign of discomfort. It was almost as if she had expected Linda to return. Linda didn't hesitate. "I need your help," she said, holding up a folder. Evelyn's gaze flickered toward it, then back to Linda's face. Linda continued, her voice steady. "I've been working on a complex mathematical model, something related to atmospheric carbon cycles. But there's a flaw in it and I can't solve it. She didn't add that she had already consulted some of the best minds in her field. She didn't mention that she had spent months obsessing over the problem, unable to break through. Evelyn studied her for a moment, then without a word she reached for the folder. Linda handed it over. She watched as Evelyn flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the dense calculations with the same calm detachment she had shown in the lecture hall. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Then after what felt like an eternity, Evelyn exhaled softly. "This is solvable." The words sent a jolt through Linda's system. She had expected Evelyn to say it was difficult, to take her time analyzing the numbers. But the confidence in her voice suggested something different. Linda's grip tightened around the notebook she was holding. "Then help me solve it," she said. Evelyn hesitated, her fingers resting on the edge of the folder. Something flickered across her face, something Linda couldn't quite place. Then finally Evelyn nodded, and just like that, everything changed. Evelyn arrived at Linda's office later that evening, the folder still in her hands. She had spent the afternoon going through the equations, cross-referencing values, breaking apart the structure of the problem piece by piece. Now, as she stepped inside, she placed the folder on Linda's desk without a word. Linda glanced up from her computer, pushing aside a half-empty coffee cup. The silence stretched between them for a few seconds before Evelyn finally spoke. "There's an inefficiency in your energy distribution model," she said. "You're losing precision in the transition between atmospheric layers. The equations don't account for the nonlinear variability of carbon dispersion under extreme conditions." Linda blinked. That was the exact flaw she had been struggling with for months. Evelyn reached for a marker and moved to the large whiteboard on the wall. Without waiting for permission, she began rewriting one of Linda's key formulas, adjusting the coefficients, adding a correction factor. Her movements were smooth, practiced, completely at ease. Linda watched in silence. She had seen visiting professors struggle through these same calculations with far less efficiency, yet Evelyn was doing it as if it were second nature. "This should stabilize the model," Evelyn said, stepping back. "If you test it now, it should work." Linda turned to her laptop, pulling up the simulation software. She entered the new values, adjusting the parameters to match Evelyn's changes. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard before she hit run. The screen flickered, processing the data. The numbers adjusted. Then after a few seconds, the results appeared. Linda inhaled sharply. It worked. No more inconsistencies. No more unexplained gaps in the calculations. For the first time since she had started working on this project, the model was complete. She looked up at Evelyn, who was watching her with quiet patience. There was no trace of arrogance in her expression, no expectation of praise. She had done what needed to be done, and now she was waiting. Linda exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "You just did something that took me 6 months to even begin to understand," she said. Evelyn gave a small shrug. "It was just a missing variable." Linda studied her for a long moment. This woman, who had spent years unnoticed in the hallways of this university, had just outperformed some of the brightest minds in the field, and she had done it without effort, without hesitation. Linda knew then that this couldn't end here. She wasn't just going to let Evelyn walk away from this. Not again. She reached for another folder, one she had been preparing since their last conversation. "There's another project I'm working on," Linda said, sliding it across the desk. "Something bigger, more complex." Evelyn hesitated before picking it up. She flipped it open, scanning the pages. Linda watched her closely. She wasn't just offering a challenge. She was offering a way back to the world Evelyn had once belonged to. The question was, would she take it? Evelyn sat at the desk, the folder open in front of her. The dense mathematical models inside weren't unfamiliar, but there was something else in these pages, something that made her pause. She traced a formula with her fingertip, absorbing its structure. Linda had been working on something far more advanced than she had initially thought. Across the desk, Linda waited. There was an intensity in her gaze, a quiet determination. This wasn't just about fixing a few equations anymore. It was about something bigger. Evelyn flipped to the next page. The research focused on atmospheric carbon modeling, an attempt to predict how small fluctuations in emissions could trigger large-scale environmental shifts. The complexity of the calculations was staggering. But what caught her attention was the anomaly buried in the data, a pattern, a repeating sequence of numbers that didn't belong. She looked up. "This isn't just a predictive model," she said. Linda exhaled. "Number. It's also an optimization project. We're trying to refine energy efficiency strategies for large-scale environmental applications." Evelyn knew what that meant. This wasn't just academic research. This was something with potential real-world consequences. If done correctly, it could change the way industries managed emissions. But if mishandled, it could be used for entirely different purposes, ones she wasn't sure Linda had considered. She leaned back, setting the folder down. "You need help with this," she said simply. Linda nodded. "I do." Evelyn glanced at the whiteboard, where their previous work still remained. She had spent years solving problems in her head, pushing equations around in silence, her mind never truly shutting off from the mathematics she had once loved. But this was different. This was an invitation. She tapped the folder. "If we do this, I need full transparency. I need to know exactly where this research is going." Linda met her gaze. "Agreed." There was no hesitation in her voice, no hidden agenda, just an open challenge. Evelyn studied her for a moment longer, then reached for a pen. She had spent too long in the shadows. It was time to step forward. Evelyn spent the next several days buried in calculations. The office that had once been a place she merely cleaned was now where she worked, side by side with Linda, running simulations, refining equations, and uncovering gaps in the existing model. The transition was so seamless that by the third day, it was as if she had always belonged there. At first, she had kept a distance, approaching the work with quiet efficiency. But as time passed, something shifted. The numbers weren't just problems to solve. They became something more, something familiar. She had spent years pushing down the part of her that once thrived on this, the part that had been forced into silence by circumstances beyond her control. Now it was reawakening, Linda noticed. She watched Evelyn work, saw the way her eyes flickered with concentration, the way her fingers moved over the keys of the computer, adjusting values before running simulations again. She recognized the same obsession she had seen in other brilliant minds. But there was something else too. Evelyn wasn't just solving problems. She was seeing things others had missed. On the fifth day, she paused in the middle of an equation, her brow furrowing slightly. She tapped a finger against the page, then turned to Linda. "This doesn't add up," she said. Linda looked over, setting down her pen. "What do you mean?" Evelyn pointed to a section of the formula, one that had been taken from earlier research. "This model assumes an even rate of carbon absorption across ecosystems, but that's not how it works in real conditions. The numbers are too clean." Linda frowned. She hadn't questioned that part of the equation before. It had been taken from an established study. But Evelyn was right. She pulled up the data set on her computer, cross-checking it against real-world samples. A few minutes later, her expression shifted. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. "You see it now." Linda exhaled, staring at the screen. The flaw wasn't just small, it was fundamental. If left unchecked, it could lead to entirely incorrect projections, models that could mislead policymakers, researchers, entire industries. "This should have been caught," Linda muttered half to herself. Evelyn studied her carefully. Maybe it was, and maybe someone ignored it. The words hung in the air. It was a possibility Linda hadn't considered before, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn was right. She straightened. "We need to go through everything again." Evelyn nodded. If there was one flaw, there could be more, and they were going to find them. Evelyn didn't stop after finding the first flaw. She spent hours combing through every detail, breaking the model apart piece by piece, searching for anything else that didn't add up. The more she looked, the more inconsistencies she found. Small deviations, seemingly harmless, but together they painted a different picture. Something was wrong with the data. Linda sat beside her, eyes scanning the reports as fast as she could process them. Her chest tightened. This wasn't just a miscalculation. These errors weren't accidental. They had been placed there deliberately. She pulled up the original data set, the one provided by the external research partners, who had been supplying her team with foundational figures. If those numbers were compromised, it meant that everything built on them was unreliable. Evelyn exhaled slowly, tapping a pen against the desk. These numbers weren't just overlooked, she said. They were altered. Linda's pulse quickened. She had trusted these numbers, based entire projections on them, and now she had no idea how deep the corruption ran. She rubbed her temple, pushing back the frustration that threatened to take over. If this is intentional, we need to know why. Evelyn leaned back, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Start with who benefits. That was the real question. If someone had manipulated the data, it wasn't random. There was a motive, money, influence, something bigger. And the fact that it had slipped past so many eyes meant that whoever was behind it was counting on no one looking too closely. Linda sat up straighter. We need access to the original raw data before it was processed. Evelyn nodded. And we need to check who's been accessing it. Linda reached for her laptop, pulling up the internal system logs. If someone had tampered with the data, there would be a trace. It might not be obvious, but it would be there. She navigated through the database, scanning for unusual activity. Minutes passed. Then, something. A pattern in the access history. A user ID that didn't belong. Someone had been retrieving files at odd hours, accessing restricted sections of the database, and making small modifications. Always subtle. Always just enough to avoid detection. Evelyn studied the logs. Who does that ID belong to? Linda hesitated before checking. When the name appeared on the screen, her breath caught. She knew them. It was someone inside the university. Someone she had worked with. Someone she trusted. She met Evelyn's gaze, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her. This just got bigger than us. Evelyn nodded. Then we handle it carefully. Linda exhaled, steadying herself. They had the proof. Now they had to decide what to do with it. Linda's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her pulse hammering in her ears. The name on the screen wasn't just a colleague. It was someone she had spoken to in meetings, shared research updates with, trusted. The realization settled in her stomach like a stone. Evelyn remained quiet, watching her reaction. There was no surprise on her face, only the patience of someone who had learned long ago that people weren't always what they seemed. Linda swallowed hard. We need to be sure. Evelyn nodded. Then we verify everything before we make a move. They spent the next several hours pulling records, cross-checking timestamps, matching modifications in the dataset to real-world outcomes. The pattern was undeniable. Key figures had been altered just enough to skew projections, making certain environmental risks appear smaller than they actually were. The errors weren't random. They were strategic. Linda leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temple. This isn't just academic fraud. This could influence policy decisions, funding, everything. Evelyn tapped a finger against the desk. Which means whoever did this had a reason? That was the part that bothered Linda the most. This wasn't the work of an incompetent researcher making mistakes. It was deliberate, precise. Someone had carefully engineered these changes to ensure they weren't obvious. Evelyn reached for the mouse, scrolling through the logs. Let's see who they were working with. Linda hesitated. Digging deeper meant stepping into something they might not be able to walk away from. But there was no turning back now. She opened the email records linked to the user ID. Most were standard university communications, nothing suspicious. But then, buried among the usual messages, something stood out. An external contact. No name. Just an anonymous account, but one that had been sending and receiving documents regularly. The messages were vague, carefully worded. But one attachment caught Linda's eye. She clicked on it. A spreadsheet opened, filled with numbers, and at the bottom a note. Adjustments approved. Proceed as planned. A chill ran down Linda's spine. Evelyn leaned in, her voice even. Someone outside the university is directing this. Linda exhaled slowly. This wasn't just academic misconduct anymore. It was bigger, and now they had proof. She looked at Evelyn, a silent question passing between them. What do we do next? Evelyn didn't hesitate. We follow the trail. Linda stared at the screen. the spreadsheet's numbers blurring as the weight of their discovery settled in. The message at the bottom: adjustments approved. Proceed as planned. Confirmed what she had feared. Someone inside the university had been modifying the data, but they weren't acting alone. There was an external force guiding this, making sure the errors weren't just unnoticed, but intentional. Evelyn sat beside her, scrolling through the email logs again, looking for anything else they might have missed. There was no signature, no direct name attached to the messages, but the timestamps matched the exact moments when the dataset had been altered. Whoever was behind this had been careful, but they had left just enough behind to be traced. Linda clenched her jaw. This isn't just about covering up bad data. It's deliberate misrepresentation. Evelyn nodded. And that means someone is profiting from it. That was the missing piece. Universities worked with government agencies, private institutions, and environmental organizations. The data they produced influenced policies, regulations, and, most importantly, funding. If these numbers were being manipulated, it wasn't for academic reasons. It was for financial gain. Linda pulled up the university's research grant records, searching for any recent projects that involved carbon emission studies. Within seconds, she found it. A multi-million-dollar grant from an energy conglomerate, funding environmental impact assessments. The very same research that Linda's team had been contributing to. Her stomach turned. Evelyn exhaled sharply. If they were adjusting numbers, they were doing it to downplay risks, make pollution seem less harmful than it is. Linda nodded. That way, regulations stay loose, and companies keep operating without restrictions. It was a perfect cycle. A corporation funds a university study. The data is subtly adjusted to make environmental damage seem smaller than it really is. Policies are made based on that data. The company keeps profiting. Evelyn tapped the screen. Look at this. Linda followed her gaze. A familiar name appeared on the grant approval list. The same professor whose user ID had shown up in the access logs. The same one who had been altering the data. Linda exhaled slowly. It wasn't just an academic scandal. It was a breach of trust at the highest level. She leaned back, pressing her fingers against her temples. If we expose this, the entire university will be pulled into it. Evelyn nodded, which is why we need to do it the right way. This wasn't just about proving what was happening. It was about making sure the truth couldn't be buried. They had to be strategic. They had to make sure that once the evidence was out, no one could ignore it. Linda turned to Evelyn. Are you sure you want to be involved in this? Evelyn met her gaze without hesitation. I didn't come back to math just to watch people abuse it. That was all Linda needed to hear. She turned back to the screen, her mind already forming a plan. They were going to expose the truth, and this time, no one was going to silence them.